A heavy silence fell over the 60 coffins, each draped in the national flag. This was no ordinary funeral. It was a symbol of a nation betrayed, a deep wound carved into its very soul. Captain Ibrahim Traore's whisper was a thunderclap. They were not just soldiers, they were our voice. His words transformed the silent grief into a demand for truth. Just days before, a Western delegation arrived in Ouagadougou, offering a seemingly benevolent partnership. Traoré, a staunch defender of national sovereignty, refused their offer. Soon after, the unthinkable happened, a deadly ambush. Drone signals were jammed, communications were cut, and 60 Burkina soldiers were killed. The timing was too perfect, the pattern too familiar. Was this a random act of war, or the price of refusing foreign interference? This tragedy in Burkina Faso echoes a continent-wide struggle against neo-colonialism, a continent where independence is proclaimed but often tested in blood and silence. This question extends beyond the flags and coffins, beyond the Sahel itself. Who truly stands with Africa, and who still pulls the strings from the shadows? Was this a tragic accident, or a hidden hand that Africa must finally confront? The attack came at dawn, the hour when silence is deepest and vigilance often wavers. But this was no ordinary clash. It was precise, almost surgical. Within 2 minutes, all communications went dark. Radios were cut, field signals died, and surveillance drones lost connection without a whisper of warning, as if an invisible hand had reached down to switch them off. Not a single distress call escaped the battlefield. The silence in the room was not natural. It was engineered. Captain Traoré's first question cut through the grief, not about the enemy's strength, but about the sky. Were there traces of foreign satellites or aircraft in the last 6 hours? The room went silent. The question was too heavy, too dangerous, too political to be answered aloud. But the silence itself was a deafening reply. By nightfall, 60 flag-draped coffins arrived in the capital. A national funeral was declared, yet a nagging suspicion lingered behind the public mourning. How could such a precise attack be executed without external intelligence? How could local insurgents suddenly disable systems designed with international support? Was this a tragic coincidence, or the invisible punishment for daring to refuse a Western partnership? The question deepened. Was Africa facing enemies only on the battlefield, or were they also lurking in the shadows of global power? For 3 days, the nation stood still. A state of mourning was declared, and the faces of the 60 fallen soldiers illuminated television screens and city billboards from Ouagadougou to the smallest village. They were no longer just names on a list. They became the embodiment of sacrifice, pride, and profound grief. Mothers wept in public squares, children carried flowers, and elders bowed their heads. Yet beneath the sorrow, another feeling began to rise: suspicion. In whispers at the market, in university debates, and in the chants of the youth, a question took shape. Is the price of standing tall always paid in blood? At the university gates, students painted banners with a haunting slogan: "Dignity has a cost, and we are paying it." It was not despair, but a collective awakening, a fierce realization that sovereignty is not granted, it is tested. The press, often cautious, began to speak with an unusual boldness, their words reflecting the nation's rising anger. A headline cut to the quick: "By rejecting the West, we are reminded who still holds the trigger." It was a bold statement that didn't directly accuse, but suggested a deep truth, that behind the veil of partnership lay pressure, punishment, and power. This was journalism as both mourning and protest, amplifying the nation's unease. In the eye of this storm, Captain Traoré chose a different path. He didn't rush to place blame or speak in rage. Instead, with calm precision, he signed a decree to expand the military's chain of command, strengthening coordination and reducing the vulnerabilities the attack had exposed. To many, this was more than a military order. It was a statement of resolve, a refusal to let tragedy weaken the march toward independence. The coffins became symbols, but so did the silence of the nation's leadership. By not hastily pointing fingers, Traoré transformed grief into discipline and suspicion into strategy. The people saw a leader who mourned with them, but was also preparing for what came next. Still, the question lingered in every conversation. Was this national funeral merely a remembrance, Or was it the opening chapter of a larger confrontation between Africa's sovereignty and the unseen hands that fear it? Build walls not just to bury heroes, but to protect the living. With these words, Captain Traoré transformed grief into a directive, turning mourning into momentum. The nation that had just buried 60 soldiers was ordered to rise not in fear, but in preparation. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract concept. It had to be defended with concrete, steel, and human will. Abandoned factories that once symbolized broken promises suddenly reawakened, their rusted gates opened to a new mission: domestic drone production. Instead of waiting for handouts from foreign donors, Burkina Faso launched a program to build its own unmanned aerial vehicle, UAV technology. Young graduates who once dreamed of leaving the country were now recruited into labs where the wings of drones took shape under their hands. Each machine was not just metal and wire, it was an act of defiance. Yet, a sharp question lingered in Ouagadougou's whispers. Could a nation long dependent on imports truly build a defense industry strong enough to withstand external pressure? Then came Operation Kulpelgo, a national initiative that blurred the line between civilian and soldier. Schools and community halls became training centers. Teachers, hunters, and farmers were called to contribute. Some learned first aid, others basic defense, and still others were trained to operate AI-powered surveillance systems. It was a mobilization not of aggression, but of resilience, where every citizen became a link in the chain of security. The message was unmistakable. Defense was no longer the business of generals alone, it was the duty of a nation. Could this blending of civilian and military strength become a model for all of Africa? For Traoré, building a wall wasn't about isolation. It was about dignity, a wall of self-reliance, of reborn industries, of awakened citizens. It was also a wall of memory, ensuring the bloodshed in the ambush would not be forgotten, but would be transformed into the bricks of national resolve. This wasn't a defensive wall to keep the world out, but a protective one to remind the world. Burkina Faso would no longer stand unshielded, nor would it bend silently to forces beyond its borders. Mobilizing civilians, producing military technology, and weaving artificial intelligence into the national defense system required immense resources, iron discipline, and unwavering unity. One misstep could shatter trust. One failure could be exploited by those who wished to see this dream collapse. The stakes were enormous, but so was the determination. The profound question now was whether Burkina Faso's wall would stand tall as a fortress of sovereignty, or be tested, cracked, and breached by the very global powers it sought to resist. The silence of mourning had barely settled when, within 48 hours of the ambush, a new chapter began. A team of Russian special forces arrived, not as occupiers or mercenaries, but as trainers. They came under conditions set by Ouagadougou. No foreign bases, no mercenary armies, no secret deals hidden from the people. This was training by invitation, with sovereignty intact. The symbolism was striking. Burkina Faso would learn, but it would not bend. And so, the tragedy of 60 coffins began to reshape itself into the seed of a new military philosophy. This philosophy now carries a name: the African doctrine of retaliation. It is not about revenge, it is about deterrence. It's about ensuring that no nation, no alliance, and no hidden hand can punish Africa for choosing its own path. Its foundation rests on 3 uncompromising pillars. The first is absolute defense sovereignty. No decisions about African soil will ever again be made in foreign capitals. From weapon procurement to officer training, from intelligence sharing to battlefield strategy, Africa must claim the authority that has too long been outsourced. The logic is simple. A nation that cannot defend itself cannot govern itself. But a critical question remains. Can fragile economies shoulder the immense burden of building such independence? The second pillar is breaking foreign pressure in all its forms: military, economic, and media. For decades, Africa's choices have been squeezed not only by armies but by sanctions, not only by markets but by narratives spun in distant newsrooms. The African doctrine insists that sovereignty means more than flags. It means the power to resist manipulation, whether through financial dependency or disinformation campaigns. The battlefield isn't just the desert, it's also the stock exchange, the news bulletin, and the social feed. But Will Africa succeed in building shields strong enough to withstand pressure cloaked in legality and diplomacy? The third pillar is civilian militarization. This isn't about endless war, but about collective resilience. In this vision, every citizen is a link in the chain of defense. Farmers who know the terrain, teachers who educate vigilance, hunters who master tracking, and youth who learn digital defense. They all become part of a living wall. This isn't the militarization of society. It's the empowerment of society. A recognition that sovereignty is defended not by armies alone, but by nations awake to their own responsibility. Yet, one must ask, can such mass mobilization inspire unity, or will it risk straining fragile communities already weary of conflict? The African doctrine is not just Burkina Faso's manifesto. It's an invitation to the continent, a call to Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. It declares that sovereignty must be owned, protected, and lived every day. It is both practical and symbolic. Practical in its training, radar, and UAV programs, and symbolic in its rejection of dependency disguised as partnership. In a world of shifting alliances, Traoré's message resonates. Africa must no longer be a chessboard. It must become the player. Still, the doctrine's future is uncertain. It is bold, ambitious, and demands sacrifices. Can a continent long entangled in external interests truly enforce such a clean break? Or will hidden hands once again find ways to destabilize the dream of self-reliance? The tragedy of 60 coffins could have left a nation paralyzed by grief. Instead, it sparked something different, an awakening that stretched beyond the barracks and into the very heart of society. What began as a military ambush soon became a cultural and civic movement, reminding the world that resistance is not only fought with weapons, but also with memory, identity, and unity. Traoré's order to build walls was heard not just by soldiers, but by teachers, artists, and even the elderly in remote villages. The message was unmistakable. Sovereignty isn't defended by an army alone. It's carried by a people who decide to live as free citizens. Mali and Niger were the first to send delegations. Military observers came, yes, but so did cultural specialists, educators, and community leaders. They wanted to see how Burkina Faso had turned mourning into mobilization. What they discovered was a rare sight in modern geopolitics, a whole-of-society defense strategy where the weapons of resistance were as likely to be textbooks and sewing machines as rifles and drones. This wasn't merely about military solidarity, it was about planting the seeds of an African renaissance where culture and defense merged into a single narrative. But can such a model, rooted in spirit and symbols, survive the harsh realities of geopolitics? In schools across the nation, children were no longer passive witnesses to the nation's struggle. They became its chroniclers and its future defenders. In Ouagadougou, 60 saplings were planted, trees of freedom, each one symbolizing a soldier lost in the ambush. Teachers explained to their students that, as these trees grew, so too must the nation's determination to stand unbroken. The image was powerful, young hands pressing roots into the earth, watering them with hope, and promising that memory would not fade. Will these children, when grown, look back and see those trees as the moment they inherited not only grief, but purpose? Bards, too, answered the call. Painters filled their canvases with scenes of resilience, soldiers marching alongside farmers, mothers cradling both infants and rifles, and doves carrying the national flag through turbulent skies. Musicians composed ballads that played on radio stations from dawn till dusk, their lyrics weaving sorrow into strength. In the marketplaces, traditional storytellers recounted the tale of the 60 fallen, transforming them into modern-day ancestors whose sacrifice would guard the living. Was this not proof that culture itself could be a shield, a fortress built from memory and pride? Even the elderly joined in. In villages long absent of industrial power, grandmothers gathered in communal halls, sewing uniforms for recruits. With each stitch, they declared that age was no barrier to resistance. For them, the fabric was a contribution, a testimony that sovereignty demands sacrifice across generations. One elderly woman's words echoed across the airwaves. "We do not bury our sons empty-handed. If they give their blood, we give our hands." Can such intergenerational solidarity withstand the test of prolonged struggle? Or will fatigue and poverty weaken its resolve? Craftsmen and artisans also found a new purpose. Blacksmiths who once forged farming tools began experimenting with protective gear. Carpenters converted school benches into makeshift supply crates for the defense forces. Tailors stitched banners with slogans of defiance, banners carried in processions that filled the streets. The lines between civilian work and national duty blurred. The economy of survival became the economy of resistance. But can this energy be sustained, or will it burn out without structural support? Meanwhile, universities open their doors not just for academic debate but for civic mobilization. Student unions organized forums titled Dignity as Defense, where law students examine sovereignty through constitutional frameworks, and engineers propose designs for low-cost drones and AI-powered radar. This merging of intellectual capital with national defense was unprecedented. Instead of waiting for foreign think tanks to dictate Africa's solutions, Burkina Faso's youth were drafting their own playbook. Will these classrooms, once quiet refugees of theory, become the laboratories of a new African sovereignty? The symbolism of it all was extraordinary. In one televised event, children stood in front of the 60 freedom trees, reciting lines from poets who once fought against colonialism. We are not shadows of another's history. We are the authors of our own dawn. The nation listened. This was not propaganda. It was pedagogy. It was not manipulation. It was memory teaching responsibility. Could this be the birth of a new civic education? One where patriotism is not blind allegiance, but active responsibility? Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the world was watching. International media often painted the Sahel as a land of despair. Yet here was a different story. Villagers sewing uniforms, children planting trees, and musicians turning grief into song. For some, it was inspiring. For others, it was unsettling. Western commentators asked whether Burkina Faso was sliding into a militarization of society. African thinkers responded differently. This is not militarization, this is emancipation. But whose interpretation will history validate? The one that fears empowerment or the one that sees it as liberation? The deeper message of this cultural mobilization is clear. Resistance is not only measured in the number of rifles, but in the unity of identity. By weaving defense into schools, art, crafts, and daily life, Burkina Faso is building something far harder to destroy than an army, a national consciousness. This consciousness cannot be bombed, sanctioned, or silenced. It is the invisible shield of a people who refuse to kneel. Yet, even shields can crack under pressure. Will this national awakening be strong enough to outlast external threats and internal fatigue? Culture has become a weapon, community a strategy, and memory an armor. Burkina Faso has shown that a wall is not just concrete and steel. It is also songs, roots, banners, and hands sewing through the night. But the path ahead is still uncertain. Can this fusion of grief and creativity evolve into long-term strength, or will it remain a momentary surge born of tragedy? One truth, however, is undeniable. For the first time in decades, Africa is witnessing a defense strategy that does not separate the soldier from the citizen or the battlefield from the classroom. It is a living doctrine of participation, where every action, whether planting a tree or composing a song, becomes part of the shield of sovereignty. Critics warned of isolation and a weakened economy cut off from traditional donors, but supporters argued that the greater danger was to remain forever in chains disguised as charity. With gold reserves tapped, cross-border trade with Mali and Niger strengthened, and new partnerships sought in Asia and Latin America, Traoré signaled that Burkina Faso would not beg, it would bargain. The path is uncertain, but the direction is unmistakable, away from the shadow of neo-colonialism and toward the dawn of self-reliance. And so, the question now lingers. Is this confrontation the beginning of Burkina Faso's collapse under sanctions, or the moment when Africa finally proves that dignity, backed by unity and resources, can outlast the pressures of empire? 60 coffins, once draped in national flags, could have been remembered as symbols of despair. But today, they echo as a rallying cry. Across Africa, conversations are shifting. People no longer ask, "What will the West say?" Instead, they whisper and proclaim aloud, "What will Traoré do next?" A continent once trained to look outward now dares to look inward, to see itself as the author of its own destiny. In classrooms, students are no longer memorizing borrowed economic theories. They are studying self-reliance, learning that sovereignty is not a dream, but a discipline. In cultural spaces, artists and storytellers are no longer glorifying dependency, but elevating independence as the highest form of dignity. And everywhere, the same piercing question arises. Is independence truly dangerous, or is it only dangerous to those who profit from our obedience? The sacrifice of 60 Burkinabe soldiers has become more than a national tragedy. It has become Africa's summons. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Bamako to Johannesburg, the idea spreads. Resistance is not chaos, it is responsibility. Traoré is no longer just a military leader. In the eyes of many, he has become the pulse of defiance, the living proof that dignity can be defended even under fire. Now history itself turns to you. Will you stand on the side of silence or on the side of sovereignty? Will you let Africa remain a chessboard or help it rise as a player? This is not just Burkina Faso's story, it is Africa's unfinished chapter. Share it widely and find your place in history.